I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on BPM. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host and very excited to get into a discussion of one of my favorite books that we're covering this semester. So I had to prepare it anyway. Once again, we're going to use a few chapters. The legendary Science of Coercion by Chris Simpson, Communication Research and Psychological Warfare, 1945 to 1960. So in my public opinion and persuasion class, we're going to be covering a few chapters. And so I thought if we're doing it there, why not do it here? We are going to go over at least the first two chapters of the book today, and then we'll see if we come back and do more. But I highly recommend it. It is a classic and something that I think everybody should check out, of course, and I'll make sure the links are available as well. Please check out my other interviews with Chris Simpson, including Academics and Cars. And then we did one at the time of the death of Ed Herman, who is, of course, most famously connected to Noam Chomsky and the manufacture of consent, or manufacturing consent. And Ed Herman, who some would argue was the principal thinker behind that duo and that analysis, was a mentor of Chris Simpson. So when he passed, Simpson came on and we did a short discussion a couple years ago about that as well. I'll put the links, make sure they're all available as well. And shout out to Chris Simpson. He's somebody who, ever since I came into contact via his work, has been very supportive and helpful. And in fact, going back to the early 2000s, this would have been when I was at the working on my doctorate in journalism and mass communication or public communication at the University of Maryland, where Chris Simpson had previously been a student. I had been introduced to his work, and from that point on, he's been very supportive and somebody whose work I was very happy to come across, because at the time I'm reading many of the people he's talking about in this work, I'm reading them outside of the context that he helps provide, which is something that I think is extremely important. And something that I wanted to that I always talk about and wanted to talk about with you all and will be with my class this semester. Specifically for me, that of course the fundamental colonization and role of imperialism, settler colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, the premises, or that premise or that basis was often left out of that context, that appropriate context, particularly as he'll talk about, and we will get into a little bit here, the post-Second World War moment, which I talk about in my own work a little bit, hence why I still find so much of this so relevant. He brings that. So as you'll see, let's get into it. And yeah, let's get into it. So I'm going to be working from this digital version of the hard copy that I actually have with this cover, Science of Coercion, Communication Research and Psychological Warfare, 1945 to 1960 by Christopher Simpson. And we are going to be covering these first two chapters here today, defining psychological war, and then World War and early modern communication research. That's the two chapters I'll be talking about with my classes in about a week or so, starting with them there. And right out the gate, I think it's very important that he starts off by defining psychological war. Because again, the context, so when we're talking about, and as I often remind anyone, propaganda is or public relations is a euphemism for propaganda, as is psychological warfare, as is mass communication, as is branding, marketing, strategic communication, political communication, ideological warfare, worldview warfare. I think, and as we'll talk about, and I've mentioned already, the interest, and it is George Creel who had talked about conquering our convictions, and then more recently, Jen Easterly talking about in terms of that CISA, Internet Digital Censorship Organization, having herself come out of the National Security Agency, talking about developing and manipulating our cognitive infrastructure. This is all the same thing, is my point. And it's all in the context of fulfilling, as Simpson talks about in these early chapters, two primary goals of the state. One of which, of course, is military conquest, and in my language or our language, imperialism, colonialism, etc. And then the other is consumerism, commercialism, the flow of business, capitalism, etc. So they're two wings of the same entity. And that's why Marshall McLuhan is still correct when he said years ago that advertising is itself a vast military operation. So that's the context here. It's military conquest, military warfare. So that's why I think it's great that Simpson starts right out the gate with a discussion of defining psychological war. And by the way, I keep being asked whenever I'm asked for a syllabus or a set of readings related to media and propaganda, et cetera. This book is among, if not the first, among the first that I mention all the time. So as he said, communication research is a small but intriguing field in the social sciences. This relatively new specialty crystallized into a distinct discipline within sociology, complete with colleges, curricula, the authority to grant doctorates and so forth between 1950 and 1955. All right, so we think about that time period. And as he describes them, these are the ideological workers whose work undergirds most college and graduate level training for print and broadcast journalists, public relations, and advertising personnel. So even today, and this book is several years old. It's originally 1992 or 3 or 4 or 5, somewhere in the maybe 96, 97, somewhere in the mid 90s. But it's the history it's pointing to, and the research he brings to bear on this is essential and still relevant. That even to this day, whether people are aware of it or not, and I do know for a fact that in many schools of journalism and communication, they don't study these foundations and these founders. So that in many cases, they're not aware of the origins that they find themselves embroiled within. Becoming the ideological workers of U.S. society. And it goes back to something I've mentioned here before, Thomas Glander's work, where, on the history of U.S. communication, mass communication. It's important to always remember that not only that context I've already talked about, but this important point that ideology and propaganda and public opinion have been major areas of concern for the ruling elite in this country from day one. From really before this was a country. Government and psychological warfare programs help shape mass communication research into a distinct scholarly field, choice of leaders in determining which of the competing scientific paradigms of communication would be funded. So who becomes the authoritative voice? So you don't have to, again, you don't have to, this is the way manipulation works. You don't have to overtly tell people, gun to the head, this is what you say, this is what you do. You select them by how you fund them, by how you write about them, how you reward and award them. So as Simpson says, this book takes up 3 tasks. First, it outlines the history of U.S. psychological warfare between 1945 and 1960. Second, it looks at the contributions made by prominent mass communication researchers and institutions to that enterprise. And then third, it examines the impact of psychological warfare programs on widely held preconceptions about communication and science within the field of communication research itself. Very important point. that when many people find themselves, even in courses that are not nominally related to this topic, but this is process-wise, methodologically, this is how many of fields of curricula are evolved and have evolved with this impetus behind them. But specific to this field of mass communication, when people are talking about sociology and media and communication and branding and marketing, what many don't realize that Simpson excavates here, unearths here. I always struggle with that. Excavate. Whatever what he unearths here is that underneath all of that research is a deep reservoir of psychological warfare programs, themselves developed with military imperial purpose behind them. Yeah, post-World War II, that very important time period. The U.S. is now the singular hegemon. It is using economic warfare to concretize its leadership. So as Simpson says, since the Second World War, the U.S. government's national security campaigns have usually overlapped with the commercial ambitions of major advertisers and media companies. Military intelligence and propaganda agencies such as the Department of Defense and Central Intelligence Agency helped bankroll substantially all of the post-World War II generation's research into techniques of persuasion, opinion measurement, interrogation, political and military mobilization, propagation of ideology, and related questions. The persuasion studies, in particular, as Simpson says, provided much of the scientific underpinning for modern advertising and motivational techniques. So here he starts talking about some of the centers and some of the names involved. Paul Lazarsfeld. I mean, I remember reading a good number of his work in grad school, but not in the context brought to bear here necessarily. I mean, now it became, sometimes a bone of contention in my classes with even some faculty and some peers. As you read their work, I always felt like you could see the politics in it. You could see the framing he was putting on it, the bias he was putting on it, but the ability for me at the time in particular, and in the way the courses were being taught absent this context most often, it was harder for me to point and demonstrate that, hey, don't you all see that this is what he's arguing here? What we're being shown as foundational communication studies theory is so clearly wedded to a certain politic. So I like, as Simpson says here, that his book is a study of the sociology of knowledge. How do we determine what is knowledge? How is knowledge produced? How does knowledge become dominant? So as Simpson says, I focus on the role of U.S. government psychological warfare programs in that process, partly because of the story of their impact on the aspect of academia has been largely forgotten or suppressed. These are strictly academic or scholarly developments on the one hand, and commercial studies for private companies on the other. So that's where he's again talking about the dominant two prongs, the commercial and the military. They all do the same thing. So that's why, as we can keep looking at, and in my course we look at all semester long, there, and as we talk about all the time here, there is an absolute parallel and similarity and overlap in the way people are sold cars, soap, presidents, religion, ideas, identity, nationalism, etc. So as Simpson says, to put most simply, they saw that as the founders of these centers and of this field saw mass communication as an instrument for persuading or dominating targeted groups. And then most importantly, as he says right out from the outset, Simpson points to, as he says here, effective persuasion and propaganda were and are widely viewed as a relatively rational alternative to the extraordinary brutality and expense of conventional war. So from the beginning, Simpson has been essential to this, as far as I'm concerned, in making plain this point that there is no, as I'm interpreting it, we can't afford to let things be simply passed as entertainment, as commercial, as innocuous money chasing. Because the exact same, again, those same processes are connected to warfare from the perspective of those who created these fields, who deploy the tactics to this day. They are seeing themselves as that media are parallel technology and weaponry in the art and practice of war. And the same goals, with the same goals that you would engage in any military conflict. Conquering of land and resources, conquering of convictions, attitudes, worldviews. More fundamentally, Simpson says, U.S. security agencies see propaganda and psychological warfare as a means to extend the influence of the U.S. government far beyond the territories that can be directly controlled by U.S. soldiers and at a relatively modest cost. The CIA's radio broadcasting into Eastern Europe, for example, became, quote, one of the cheapest, safest, most effective tools of U.S. foreign policy, as Gene Kirkpatrick, long a vocal proponent of U.S. psychological operations, argued. The primary object of U.S. psychological operations during this period was to frustrate the ambitions of radical movements in resource-rich developing countries seeking solutions to the problems of poverty, dependency, and entrenched corruption. So that's why, and as we've talked about here, we will continue to, the same tactics used overseas to suppress colonized communities were brought home and are brought home and turned, and as Simpson has already pointed out here in these opening pages, to targeted communities here. Communities being targeted here for the same purpose, to suppress movements seeking to address problems of poverty, dependency, and entrenched corruption. And a lot of it is, as Simpson points out, as we're seeing happening again today, is a resurgence, or well, a lot of what was happening then, as again we're seeing happening here today, is a concern over communism, or the claimed concern and threat of communism. So as Simpson is talking about here in his reference briefly to Joseph Stalin, who ruled the Soviet Union with extraordinary brutality, says Simpson. So, anyway, I'm far from competent on this issue, but I would like for more. Anyway, I'd like to discuss that more. Up until his death in 1953, and many in the West regarded the terror of the Stalin years to be the defining feature of every communist society. That's the point I'm trying to get at here. Regardless of what anybody thinks of Stalin or whatever he actually did or didn't do, he became a symbol of how I would phrase it, of what every society headed towards communism could be rebranded to be. That is, he became the defining symbol that allows, to this day, people to broadly associate him with Hitler and Mao Zedong and anyone engaged certainly in actual communism or socialism to be rebranded as one of those forms, as a Stalin-esque form of tyrant. And I would argue that a lot of that started right at this time that Simpson is talking about. It's not even that I would argue. I think that argument has been made brilliantly by many people for a long time. But the point I'm not thoroughly comfortable with the way Simpson just passingly describes Stalin here. But what I do think is important is that from the perspective of those in power, Stalin came to represent a symbol that could be easily attached. And we'll come back to that point in a minute about the deployment of symbol that could be easily deployed when the word or the idea of communism comes up. People can just say, "Oh, it's authoritarian, it's violent, it's hostile, it's undemocratic. We don't want that." Now, Simpson does talk about both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States. Everybody is engaged in some form of psychological warfare propaganda. This is not my blanket defense of everything Soviet or certainly Russian. It is just simply to say that the attitudes towards the Soviet Union, to Russia today, towards communism or any critique of capitalism is often blanketed under this critique of Stalin-esque violence and authoritarianism. But as Simpson points out here, the Soviet view of the international competition between them and the United States, in contrast, was that the United States was an expansionist empire. So again, much like today, just throwing that out there, that the United States had already absorbed much of Western Europe and the former European colonies into a post-war international economic order built around the dollar. Does that not sound somewhat relevant and familiar? That according to the Soviet Union, the United States had isolated the Soviet Union internationally, severely restricting trade, and embarked on a clandestine campaign to overthrow the governments of the Soviet Union and several of its satellite states. It had openly intervened in Korea and secretly sponsored coups in a growing list of developing countries. The United States had twice used atomic bombs on civilian populations, the Soviets pointed out, and had on several occasions threatened nuclear attacks on the USSR, China, Korea, and Vietnam. So, given this is again where the idea became popularized that psychological warfare was a peaceful means of war. And as we're going to come back to, whereas he evolves to here shortly, what constitutes psychological warfare can be any number of different things. And I would argue today, podcasts, YouTube channels. In reality, though, the U.S. and Soviet psychological warfare programs each fed its rivals' appetite for escalated conflicts, particularly in contested countries in the in the third world. At heart, modern psychological warfare has been a tool for managing empire, to suppress, and this is where I've gotten the phrase I've used for decades now, unauthorized communication, and is applied to even domestic U.S. dissenters. That from the perspective of those in power, psychological warfare and propaganda are offered as alternatives, have only rarely offered alternatives to violence over the medium to long term. Instead, they have been an integral part of strategy and culture whose premise is the rule of the strong at the expense of the weak, where coercion and manipulation pose as communication and close off opportunities for other more genuine forms of understanding. The problem with psychological warfare is not so much the content of individual messages, it is instead its consistent role as an instrument for maintaining grossly abusive social structures, notably in global North-South relations. And I would argue that those North-South relations play themselves out even internally to those within the global North, like internalized colonized Black America. So I love that he points this out, that, look, those in power are saying, look, we'll engage in the psychological warfare to reduce cost and violence if necessary, though we know that doesn't work over the long term. We know we got to get busy at some point. But the goal of that communication is coercion and manipulation. So that's why, again, I'm saying when they're saying it's just a movie or just a song, I think we need to catch up to this point, that it's coercion and manipulation posing as something else. So as he says, in the end, U.S. military and intelligence agencies became instrumental in the systematic elaboration of an interlocking series of concepts about communication that have defined much of the post-World War II communication research. Their goal, as he points out here, is communication as domination, another one of my favorite phrases that he uses. Federal agencies such as the Department of Defense, U.S. Information Agency, and Central Intelligence Agency, and their forerunners provided the substantial majority of funds for all large-scale communication research projects by U.S. scholars between 1945 and 1960. And they spent annually as much as $1 billion on these activities as early as the 1950s. So this is why I keep saying, for decades, billions of dollars, endless amounts of resource have been spent on studying how to manipulate people in a variety of situations all over the world. And he meticulously details this throughout the course of the book. There's a lot of cited resources, citations, details, data that he points to. So I mean, it can't be overstated how important this component of the history is. Ford Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, all were involved, as we'll see later, the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, all the dominant intelligence agencies, billions of dollars for decades and ongoing. Government agencies sought scientific data on the means to manipulate targeted populations at home and abroad, and they were willing to pay well for it at a time when there was very little other funding available for large-scale communication studies. Further, some powerful factions of the government, notably the FBI and other domestic security agencies, aggressively repressed rival scientific concepts concerning communication, particularly those of critical thought they regarded as subversive. Because of the bitterness of the Cold War, the influence of McCarthyism, and the strength of clandestinely funded ideological campaigns then underway among U.S. scholars, each of which is discussed in more detail in later chapters, unorthodox analysis of the relationships between communication and ideology could lead to professional ostracism, hostile FBI investigation, attacks in the press, and even violence, with still carrying similar risks to today. So this idea, again, that everybody in academia is just chilling and nobody takes risks and everybody's just an ivory tower scholar. No, there's been a lot of effort to assure that people stay in line. So we even were reading, when I first read this book, we were literally reading a book titled something like Founding Fathers, the History of Communication Studies, Founding Fathers. And it was interesting. They consider Marx to be one of the founding fathers because of his influence on the humanities and anyway. But discussing Marx and his ideas in the classroom wasn't necessarily welcomed, and an honest assessment of his arguments wasn't necessarily welcome. But they did have to at least acknowledge that Marx had influenced a lot of people in around the world, obviously outside of academia, but also within academia in terms of particularly of sociology, psychology, philosophy, all of which were seen as component cores. Sociology, I think I said component cores to the original field of mass comm. U.S. psychological warfare programs between 1945 and 1960 provide a case study of how the priorities and values of powerful social groups can be transformed into the received knowledge of the scientific community and to a certain extent of society as a whole. It is a twofold story. First, the successes and failures of the government's efforts to achieve and the engineering of consent of targeted populations at home and abroad, and contained within that the story of the mechanisms by which consent was achieved among the scientists who had been hired to help with the job. I love that part. The mechanisms by which consent was achieved among the scientists. How are people manipulated into producing the kind of research that supports the military and the business community? What then is psychological warfare? According to William Doherty, the term first appeared in English in a 1941 text on the Nazis' use of propaganda, fifth column activities, and terror in the early stages of the European War. Since World War II, U.S. military and NATO manuals have typically defined psychological warfare or psychological operations as tactics as varied as propaganda, covert operations, guerrilla warfare, and more recently, public diplomacy, another good euphemism. Each of these conceptualizations of psychological warfare explicitly links mass communication with selective application of violence, murder, sabotage, assassination, insurrection, counter-insurrection, as a means of achieving ideological, political, or military goals. Within the present context, psychological warfare can best be understood as a group of strategies and tactics designed to achieve the ideological, political, or military objectives of the sponsoring organization, typically a government or political movement, through exploitation of a target audience's cultural, psychological attributes and its communication system. Put another way, Psychological warfare is the application of mass communication to modern social conflict. It focuses on the combined use of violent and more conventional forms of communication to achieve political military goals. That's just bars.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
I mean, and I just think it's dope. I just think it's funny when you watch him in Academics and Cars or elsewhere. Chris Simpson is just this small white dude with glasses, very unassuming, soft talking, very, but his words are they punch like hammers. And again, I just can't appreciate enough or emphasize enough what he's saying here and how important it is. And this is actually an explanation of the colonial function of not only the university, but even intellectual inquiry. Because part of what he's saying here is required, and this is why mass communication and communication studies have often involved anthropology and other forms of, it's a very interdisciplinary field, is because you have to study the target audience. What is their cultural or psychological attribute? Or are there attributes that can be manipulated? How does their communication system function and work? Got to know how it works before I've talked about it before. Many have talked about it. A lot of the work we as academics and others produce, it's the intellectual version of what happens in social media. When we post pictures and whatever to Instagram, we are willfully giving over content to be mined and used against us by those in power. It's no different than when we study ourselves and produce research and papers and articles and make podcasts and videos about how great this is and what our people do here and how we work here. That is mined by those in power so that they can then target messaging in a way that disrupts that. As Simpson continues, some of this was kept secret until he, as he says, until he obtained a collection of early psychological warfare planning records through a Freedom of Information Act request. That is to the U.S. Army. Sorry, a more complete illustration of U.S. government's view of psychological warfare can be found in the definition used by the U.S. Army in war planning. So he got the definition. Psychological warfare employs all moral and physical means other than orthodox military operations, which tend to destroy the will of the enemy to fight, deprive him of the support of his allies and neutrals, increase in our own troops and allies the willingness to a will to victory. Psychological warfare employs any weapon to influence the mind of the enemy. The weapons are psychological only in the effect they produce, and not because of the nature of the weapons themselves. I love that point that they are highlighting there for us to look at so many years later, because this is so important. Psychological warfare is only defined as psychological because of the effect on the mind that is produced. The weapon, the warfare itself, can be of any variety. It can be media, it can be a commercial or entertainment or a song or a book, but it can also be physical violence and anything in between. As we've talked often about here, lynching historically, or the forms that takes today, is not just meant to abuse and horrify the individual victim. It's mass terror. All of these police killings that we get routinely videotaped now and distributed, that's mass terror. It is psychological warfare because of the effect they produce, not because of the nature of the weapons themselves. And then as this goes on, whether it's white, black, or gray propaganda, it involves also all, guerrilla warfare, espionage, political, cultural, economic, and racial pressures are all effective weapons. They are effective because they produce dissension, distrust, fear, and hopelessness in the minds of the enemy, not because they originate in the psyche or propaganda of psychological warfare agencies. I love that he got that in there. So if obviously white propaganda is simplicity, clarity, repetition. It is designed to be perceived by its audience as truthful, balanced, and factual. So this is, mainstream media news. Voice of America. Black propaganda is in contrast is stress, trouble, confusion, and terror. And then gray propaganda is something in between that uses some of both and typically involves false information about rivals in the news. Throughout this book, Simpson says, psychological warfare and psychological operations encompass this range of activities as specified by the Army and the National Security Council. Several points should be underlined. First, psychological warfare in the U.S. conception has consistently made use of a wide range of violence, including guerrilla warfare, assassination, sabotage, and more fundamentally, the maintenance of manifestly brutal regimes in client states abroad. Second, it has also involved a variety of propaganda or media work ranging from overt white newscasting to covert black propaganda. Third, the targets of U.S. psychological warfare were not the only enemy, but also the people of the United States and its allies. So again, he talks about some of the foundational figures, many of whom I've read at least some of just through the process of my grad work, and Laswell, Littman, Public Opinion Quarterly, which is still going on and still producing work. I was in fact looking at it this morning, and that's where Simpson gets into them a little bit more in this second chapter, which we'll get into ourselves now. World War and early modern communication research. He notes that this has been something that has been studied for a long time, going back to even Sun Tzu, talking about psychological tactics. But it was not until World War I that the U.S. government institutionalized and employed psychological warfare in its modern sense. In 1917, President Woodrow Wilson appointed George Creel to lead an elite committee of public information made up of the U.S. Secretaries of War, Navy, and State. As Harold Laswell wrote, Creel's new office was the equivalent of appointing a separate cabinet minister for propaganda, responsible for every aspect of propaganda, both at home and abroad. And Wilson played a heavy role in this. Of course, he presided over the psychological warfare, not considered by Simpson here, but Wilson also presided over the psychological warfare addressed to the domestic population, black and white, in the guise of Birth of a Nation. And happily used that as a support for the development of a new whiteness and a standard of whiteness in this society. But anyway, by the time the United States entered World War II in 1941, there was only one officer in the U.S. War Department General Staff who had psychological warfare experience. So in other words, what he's saying here is that after World War I, up until World War II, there was a sort of a downtick of sorts in the interest of the study, and then it picked up again after the Second World War, during the Second World War. So Simpson talks about Harold Laswell and Walter Lippmann, who deserve their own separate discussions, but these again are he used them as exemplars. They were major figures at the time, but I think they are also good exemplars of the kinds of discussion and the focus of the research at this time, and the sort of the focus of the concerns. They were prominent, they were well funded, they had a variety of elite state interest relationships, and and their work probably is still, even if people aren't necessarily aware directly or consciously aware of the direct ties, is still influential in media studies to this day. Laswell and Lippmann argued that new technologies for communication and transportation had awakened millions of disenfranchised people to a world outside their factories and villages, but that the traditional economic, political, and social structures that had shaped life during the 19th century remained in place. This led to potential explosions as Laswell and Lippmann saw things, including the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the wave of labor rebellions that swept through Europe and the United States in the wake of World War I. So again, just like it's happening today, where those in power look at the landscape and see all of the continuing and increasing inequality, and instead of saying let's redistribute and make the world better, one of their primary things, one of their primary go-tos is more propaganda and more war. So that's what Lippmann and Laswell were saying. All this technology is creating a world that everyone now has access to and awareness of, but we're not changing the relationship that has created the inequality that has kept them, quote unquote, in darkness all this time. So when they start saying, what's up, we need to have a response to that. Lippmann and Laswell offered up a response, a media communicative response, offered up suggestions for how to maintain this inequality or maintain the appropriate for them, from their point of view, power balance or imbalance in this newly awakened world. And they talked about, as he says here, the pictures in our heads. Lippmann was famously writing about, in between the two world wars, the ability to create the pictures in people's heads through newspapers, through storytelling, through obviously later on the emergence of wider distribution of film. And talked about, as he said, the highly influential concept of the stereotype, and consented communication and transportation technologies had created a world that we have to deal with politically that is out of reach, out of sight, out of mind. The pictures in our heads of this world, the stereotypes, are acted upon by groups of people or by individuals acting in the name of groups. This led Lippmann to conclude that representative government cannot be worked successfully no matter what the basis of election unless there is an independent expert organization for making the unseen facts of the world intelligible to those who have to make the decisions. The converse of that proposition was that the decision makers had a responsibility to repair the defective organization of public opinion, as Lippmann put it, in the interests of social efficiency and the greater good. Right. And as Bernays would point out, this is, and I'll just pause this briefly to show, as I've done before, we've talked about before, but this is what Edward Bernays talked about at the beginning of his book on propaganda. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. This is just more or less Lippmann's point in unity or unison or with what Bernays had said a few years earlier, or right about the same time. I think 1920, 1922 was when all these books were written. Similar to what's being argued today. I forgot what the newfangled phrase of it is, but it's just this idea that those in power deserve to be there and they must create everything from the wealth to the opinions about the wealth for everyone else. The social sciences offer tools that could make administration of what would otherwise be highly unstable social structures relatively rational and effective, he contended. In other words, academia, or this emerging, what would emerge as a field of mass communication research would be, and as I noted here, even the functions of universities were here to organize the research and the methods and the dissemination of the psychological warfare that would manage society, manipulate public opinion, assist military and commercial operation. Laswell extended the idea, giving it a Machiavellian twist. He emphasized employing persuasive media and selectively using assassinations, violence, and other coercion as a means of communicating with and managing disenfranchised people. He advocated what he regarded as scientific application of persuasion and precise violence in contrast to bludgeon tactics. So just as Obama used to argue that when he was popularizing drone strikes, hey, you know, we're targeted, we're limiting the amount of violence, you know what I mean? You know, we're as Laswell said, we're just communicating with folks. Laswell went on to say in 1933 that successful social and political management often depends on proper coordination of propaganda with coercion, violent or nonviolent, economic inducement, including bribery, diplomatic negotiation, and other techniques. And I noted here that imposed material instability can on its own be seen as psychological warfare and part of a broader apparatus of propaganda, allowing for easier, cheaper societal management. So I'm just saying, yeah, if coercion can include bribery and economic inducement, you could certainly argue that having people impoverishing people is an inducement for them to fall in line and follow the preferred behavior and instructions of the day. And then, of course, if that doesn't work, you just violently communicate with them. Laswell understood that communication is intimately bound up with social order. Looked at dialectically, human communication and various forms of social order seem to define one another, to establish one another's boundaries. They simply cannot exist in isolation from one another. In this sense, communication might be understood as both the conduit for and the actual substance of human culture and consciousness. Once again.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
That is absolute bars. We're not just talking about entertainment. We're not just talking about music. We're not just talking about this is deeply serious. So people shouldn't just say, oh, well, what do you expect Hollywood to do? Or what do you expect Netflix and Hulu to do? We have to look at these things much more critically and with much more hostility. Everything, given this context and the persistent inequality that continues in this country and around the world. You cannot have social order, just like the late John Judge used to say, you can't have organized crime without organized police. You cannot have social order. You cannot have an organized criminal social order like we have here without an organized, concomitantly parallel, violent, communicative order and arrangement. Human communication and various forms of social order seem to define one another, to establish one another's boundaries. That's why I keep saying you can't reform media. We can't just make better movies and better songs, because that which becomes dominant and sanctionable and even recognizable to the colonized is prescribed by the pre-existing social order and boundaries. So if we want a new form of cultural expression, we have to have a new social order. Because as he says again correctly, communication is best understood as a conduit for and the actual substance of human culture and consciousness. In terms of the word communication, he says etymologists say the word entered the English language around 14th century, derived from the Latin com, literally together, and munia, duties, meaning the sharing of burdens. Actually, that's pretty deep too. And this is to be understood as distinct from existing primarily as a medium for communicating or giving directions. So that's why, for instance, those of us who prefer to define our work as media studies or communication studies have always bristled and struggled, for instance, with narrowly teaching journalism, or people who redefine communication and media studies as that which as some vocational preparation for job training. No. Whether you, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, the true understanding of communication and media studies is a broad, it's the full discursive environment or potential of variety involved. It is all, man, it is the environment itself that is involved here. It involves so much more than a conduit for order. But those who want order and power, that's all that they're interested in having, at least the popular discussion of the field be considered. Those who actually study and engage the field, again, regardless of political perspective. I'm struggling with this because in some ways, like, this is understood in academia, and there's a great amount of effort to appeal to that broader. But then there is this battle within the field and within the university system to reduce it to just job training and a narrow, overly simplified, hey, it's just messages from one to the other, and it just gives directions. It's I feel like I'm not doing the best in explaining the difference there, but maybe I'll come back to it, or hopefully you all get the point that I'm making here. So to that point, he talks about, again, Lippmann and Laswell's articulation of communication as domination permitted a significant step forward in applying the positivist scientific method to the study of social communication. And he talks about positivism a little bit. We got into it in grad school, I remember. And it's basically just a heavily quantitative, mechanistic methodology that allows everything to be reducible. I think actually he says, I think I got his oh no, it's just a way of, it just allows for people to reduce everything to numbers and then build up, based on research of those numbers, some sort of objective, because everything is an objective conclusion, right? There's no bias involved when you do it that way, is the claim. But by reducing communication to the Laswellian model of who says what to whom and where, et cetera, it became possible for the first time to systematically isolate and measure those aspects of communication that were of greatest relevance to powerful groups in society. And that's really the point. I'm not interested in other words, from their perspective, they're saying, I just want to learn how to manipulate people so I can sell them a product, an identity, or themselves as being willing to go to war. For mass consumer societies to establish and maintain themselves, it seems to be necessary for media to have the capacity to sell the attention of mass audiences to advertisers who use that attention to promote their goods and services. To do that successfully, media organizations must have some means for measuring popular attention and similar indices in order to effectively market their services to potential advertisers. And I've noted here, it sounds like anything happening today. That's certainly my argument with the MOBP, with the myth of buying power, black buying power in general, that we live in a consumer society, and that from their primary, at least on one side of the two-pronged mission, is to sell audiences to advertisers, so advertisers can sell products and reduce audiences to products. From the advertiser's point of view, however, the simple sale of products and services is not enough. Their commercial success in mass market depends to an important degree on their ability to substitute their values and worldview for those previously held by their audience, typically through seduction and deflection of rival worldviews. In mass consumer societies, many customers do not simply purchase commodities, they instead eventually become them, literally and figuratively. So I've said it this way many times, that we're not just being sold a hamburger in a commercial, we're being sold as consumers to advertisers, not just as consumers to advertisers, but we are being sold an entire ideological apparatus that says the mass production of food, factory farming, eating animals, eating cows, doing all of this is good. The farm to table capitalist model of farm to table is good. So you have to deflect rival worldviews when you're even creating a commercial for a burger. And he talks about the creation of voiceless, ordinary people, rebranded as slogans: Pepsi Generation, Heartbeat of America, I love what you do for me. And I made a note here, like, what are today's top slogan? Of course, I could only think it could only be Jared. But what are today's top advertising slogans? I'd be interested. Put them in the comments. Put them in the comments. Hey, you got a top slogan for the 21st century, or in late summer 2023?
Put it in the comments.
And then, as he says, that process, that this process of sloganeering and measuring mass audiences and applying media and messaging to media, the process, moreover, consistently has been marked by great violence, frequently including genocide, as the modern world overwhelms indigenous cultures and people. So again, Simpson is constantly reminding us of the military application of this, that it's not, you're not just studying markets necessarily to sell to, but you're studying markets to manipulate in any manner, form, or manner. And if you can't manipulate them into selling them your products, then maybe you need to, again, communicate with them differently. So as Simpson continues, a community, after all, cannot exist without some form of social order, or put another way, order defines the possible means of sharing burdens. Laswell and Lippmann, however, advocated not just order in an abstract sense, but rather a particular social order in the United States and the world in which forceful elites necessarily ruled in the interest of their vision of the greater good. A U.S.-style consumer democracy was simply a relatively benign system for engineering mass consent for elites' authority. And then again, he comes back to this issue of literacy, in the traditional literacy, but I think we could apply to the concept of financial literacy as well. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where we come back to that notion of the deployment of the appropriate symbol. Laswell writes that the spread of literacy did not release the masses from ignorance and superstition, but altered the nature of both and compelled the development of a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda. So again, Laswell is saying, again, this emerging new world, where the former colonies and the former black enslaved and the former indigenously genocided, they're emerging, they're coming into a new world, in part because of the technology, the communication technology we've sent out into the world. We're bringing them into it, but we're not meaning to change the social relationships. We're not meaning to change the social relationships. So we have to come up with something else. And he's saying that dominant new method of technique of control is through propaganda. So he says a propagandist's regard for men rests on no democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. The modern propagandist, like the modern psychologist, recognizes that men are often poor judges of their own interests. Those with power must cultivate sensitiveness to those concentrations of motive, which are implicit and available for rapid mobilization when the appropriate symbol is offered. The propagandist is no phrasemonger, but a promoter of overt acts. Again, from the opposite political pole, from an opposing political enemy.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
I'm not even necessarily consciously aware of it at this point anymore. I've read this so many times over so many years, but this must be where I keep getting that, because I keep coming back in my own work and my own commentary to this point that this is not just some benign messaging for messaging's sake. That behind the message, the goal is to manage public opinion, to manipulate behavior. That's what Laswell is saying here. He's saying there is this new world that we have to control through propaganda. And we're not just here to throw out words. We're not just phrase mongering. We're not just throwing out slogans to come up with a new slogan. We're not just selling a product. We're trying to manipulate the world's majority into submission. Communication as domination. We are promoters of, as he says, of overt acts. We want them to go out and do something. We want them to fight for us. We want them to die for us. We want them to shop for us. We want them to work for us. We want them to accept the identity we've given them. We want them to behave in a desired manner. Not just out here making commercials and movies. That's why the Rockefeller Foundation gets involved. That's why to this day, Public Opinion Quarterly was founded by people who come out of these intelligence-based, military-based research interests and elite Princeton universities to found these journals so that they create a democratic prophylaxis that could immunize the United States' large immigrant population from the effects of Soviet and Axis propaganda. As again, we've talked about all the time, they're learning how do you make Europeans white Americans? You need a democratic prophylaxis. We need to protect and immunize these new whites so that they don't become threatening communists. Simpson continues, briefly, the elite of the United States, those who have money to support research, as Laswell bluntly put it, should systematically manipulate mass sentiment in order to preserve democracy from threats posed by authoritarian societies such as Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. Again, as I said earlier, they still to this day. So now the Soviet Union, that was the primary reason for the defeat of Nazi Germany, now they're just equated with the Nazis. That's convenient. So he does that, as Simpson does, and this again goes back to a point that I really appreciate in Thomas Glander's work and others, that we are encouraged to not think of how important all of this is, but those in power have been arguing, thinking about this carefully and with great amounts of resource for a long time. So even competing a little bit with Laswell is Donald Schlesinger here, who was saying back in the day that Laswell was ultimately advocating for a new form of authoritarianism, that through the Rockefeller Foundation and all of this other influence, even though he's a participant, he said, we have been willing without thought to sacrifice both truth and human individuality in order to bring about given mass responses to war stimuli. We have thought in terms of fighting dictatorships by force through the establishment of dictatorship by manipulation, he said. Right, and Glanders, that was my point about Glander. So though the phrase psychological warfare is reported to have first entered the English in 1941, it was picked up almost immediately by William Wild Bill Donovan, then director of the newly established U.S. Intelligence Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, viewed as an understanding of Nazi psychological tactics as a vital source of ideas for Americanized versions of the very same stratagems. For Donovan, psychological warfare was destined to become a full arm of the U.S. military equal to in status to the Army, Navy, and Air Force, with the goal of engineering consent. And that his goal of psychological warfare was all-encompassing. Donovan's visionary dream was to unify these functions in support of conventional military unit operations, thereby forging a new instrument of war. Just more about the deeply ensconced nature of all of this. That all of this was deeply embedded, likely still is deeply embedded in all of the war, those who study war and the need for war, who benefit most from war. And Simpson says that the projects helped define U.S. social science and mass communication studies long after the war had drawn to a close. And then he talks about, whether it's through the Public Opinion Quarterly Journal or other, these main centers of psychological warfare that included Donovan, the Rand Corporation still in operation today, all of these elite universities, that so much of this work would trickle down into mainstream media, mainstream academia, with many of its preconceptions and base conceptions accepted even unconsciously today. He talks about this old boy or girl network that passed all of this work down. He even references some survey research done by members of these research communities to see how much of it prevailed throughout the 80s into the 1980s, which really formed the basis of the work taught to those who taught me, and explains why I had so much of an issue in my own experience. And then we can see directly that, how that would be passed on into the classrooms of today, because the people that taught me in the early 2000s had themselves been brought up on the basis of a lot of this work in the 80s. They were seen as the dominant members of the field at the time in many cases. And many of their students are proliferating and having successful careers in all manner of media and academic positions throughout the country and the world. So it makes very good sense to me. It's very clear how all of these original precepts and preconceptions would still be at play today. As he says here, many of the people involved became publishers of Time, Look, Fortune magazines, worked at all these newspapers and press outlets, Viking Press, that published Manning Marable's, the book, the final book attributed to Manning Marable, nominally about Malcolm X, Pulitzer Prize winner, CBS chairman, Eisenhower speechwriter, founder of Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. And again, to conclude with Simpson, those that have put this together regarded mass communication as a tool for social management and as a weapon in social conflict. So that's just a relatively quick look at those first two chapters of The Science of Coercion. I am a big fan of Chris Simpson's work and appreciate him even more personally as someone who has supported and helped me, not only in terms of what I understand about the field and the history of these related topics, but as just a fellow academic, when not a lot of people will. So I got to shout him out for that. And again, the links will be provided, but make sure you check out his other interviews with me on this platform. Definitely check out this and other work from Chris Simpson and others like it. And yeah, make sure you like, share, subscribe, comment, join, and support BPM on Patreon. And hope you got some enjoyment out of this discussion as much as I did. Anyway, peace if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say, and we'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like.